go ahead. You can just direct message myself or Paige if that's the case. So this is actually our first WIELD virtual career development session. And WIELD is actually a new organization. It's focused on women inspiring and elevating leadership in diabetes. And some of you may know about our leadership team, which is how you got this invitation. Some of you may have seen us at a conference where we've tried to hold some career development sessions and roundtables. I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Durga Singh. I'm a pediatric endocrinologist, a physician scientist, and an assistant dean for tenure track faculty at the University of Michigan. And I'm the lead for the WIELD Educate subgroup. And today, Paige Trojanowski, up at my corner, but I don't know where she is on everyone else. So she just waved there, is a T32 postdoctoral fellow in clinical psychology at the Barbara Davis Center at the University of Colorado, and is also a member of the Educate subgroup. And we have had a really active committee. And one of the things that we've been doing is we've been surveying junior faculty and postdocs to find out what topics would be interesting for you to hear about from leaders in our field, specifically women leaders in diabetes, obesity, metabolism research. I'm actually going to, before we get started, put a link to the WIELD website. If any of you are interested in learning more or signing up for future sessions, you'll get information by doing that. The group really started because we felt that many of our members had been a part of the Women's Interprofessional Network of the American Diabetes Association, and we felt there was a need to strategize to elevate and support diversity in diabetes. After our survey of topics, one of the top sessions that rose to the top was this topic about work-life integration. I know many of you submitted questions ahead of time. A lot of them were more work balancing and time management, so we may not get to all of those questions today, but I'm hoping that'll be a great session in the future. And if you have questions as you're going along, or you didn't directly RSVP but want to get added to our email list for attending this session, please go ahead and enter your information into the Google Doc that I just entered. And we can post those again at the end of the session. So our panelists today are really quite amazing women leaders in the field. And I'm not going to read all of their bios because that would take us probably this whole hour. So just briefly to introduce them, and they will introduce themselves as well. We have Dr. Judith Regensteiner, Distinguished Professor and Director of the Ludman Family Center for Women's Health Research at the University of Colorado. Let's see if we're going to try to pin all of them. Hopefully we do this correctly. Dr. Anne-Marie Richards, Director and Patient Engagement Lead at Pfizer. And Dr. Jane Reusch, Professor in Endocrinology at Colorado University, and one of the formative American Diabetes Association leaders responsible for actually the formation of the Women's Interprofessional Network for the ADA, which really is the inspiration for this WIELD group. So we thought it would be great if we could have our panelists kind of set the stage for our discussion by introducing themselves and describing their own career paths and work-life goals, and how they ended up choosing the careers that they ended up going towards at this time. And I'd like to start this with Dr. Regensteiner, if that's okay.
Thank you, Durga, Dr. Singer. I really appreciate being here today. And a lot of what I've learned about work-life integration has been from my daughter, who's a young future academic working on her PhD in clinical psychology, because one of the things I note is that young people today don't want to have the work integration, which is what a lot of us still do quite a bit of. I'm Judith Regensteiner. I'm a PhD professor at the University of Colorado, and my research is in the cardiovascular consequences of type 2 diabetes. I do a lot of work in more the cardiovascular physiology realm. And I work with Dr. Jane Reusch and have worked with her as a research partner for many years, which is another wonderful idea, is to have partners who make life and work more fun. So she and I have worked together for many years. One thing I think is that people nowadays are not going to tolerate working, as I did, and I'm sure many of you do, when I started my career, pretty much all the time. If I wasn't working, I was taking a break from work. And when I look back, I see this is not a sustainable lifestyle. I mean, my husband and I like to travel and do many other things, but I still struggle with not working as my default effort. And again, watching my daughter just says she works really hard, but she wants to enjoy her time off, and she takes time off, and she still works really hard, but it's very different. So my idea is that we should celebrate people's lives as well as their work, and never make young faculty feel like they're there to produce things. You're going to be as good as you produce. In other words, how many grants you write, how many papers you write, and that's it. It's about people as people. And so you can celebrate having a child. When I was pregnant, I was really afraid to tell people because I thought they wouldn't take me seriously as a scientist. No one should ever, ever have to feel that way. So I think celebrating people's lives and life events or whatever's important to them as besides their work is also important. And I think if we make people feel welcome and embraced as human beings, not just, again, producers of products, I think we're more likely to retain people into academia. And that's really important at a time when young scientists are leaving academia, particularly physician scientists. So we got to make it a fun and inclusive career, not just a career of constant work. Because when you say it that way, that really doesn't sound like fun. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it next to Dr. Richards to share about her journey and as well as her thoughts on work-life integration.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I am Anne-Marie Laurent Richard. I am currently patient engagement lead in the internal medicine unit at Pfizer. I like to say that I'm a Caribbean girl. I like mentioning the fact that I grew up in the Caribbean because I think, my years growing up in the Caribbean are some of the most formative years of my life. They really sort of dictate the woman that I am today and the principles that I hold dear. And so I always tend to mention that. I migrated to the US in 1991 to pursue my bachelor's degree. I attended Suffolk University in Boston. And that was inspired by my mom, who was a nurse at the time. So my mom was the matron of the children's ward at one of the hospitals back home. And I came from a tiny island in the Caribbean, Dominica, 79,000 people. Pretty much everybody knows, someone, either you or your family. And I saw my mom really having an impact on people's lives, including saving lives. And so that really inspired me to want to do the same. I mean, I had people, who had been treated by my mom meeting me on the road and thanking me and telling me what my mom had done for them. And it really brought joy to me. And so this was one of the things that really inspired me. So I came to the US to go to medical school. So I will say, long story short, a couple of years after undergrad, I ended up getting married. I had my first son. And for numerous reasons, I chose to do a PhD versus an MD. And one of the reasons was after having a child, I thought that getting a PhD would give me a better work-life balance because I thought medical school was going to be very demanding. And so I ended up, doing my PhD at BU with Dr. Tonheim, Keith Tonheim, in the diabetes field. I am an islet biologist by training. And then I stayed on after my PhD working with Dr. Corky for some time as instructor of medicine, and then went into industry. I went into industry because I thought that would give me, or probably help me fulfill my passion of working more closely with patients. Obviously in academia, I worked, at the bench doing very basic science. I will say that, it was a real wake-up call for me. And that was probably my first big experience having to balance work and life. Having a young child, my husband was literally mom and dad. But I worked with great people who were very supportive. And I will say one of the things that I think really helped me to balance is communication, right? communicating with my husband about, the priorities I had at school, but also communicating with my colleagues, my PI, and letting them know what I was facing, what my life was, what my background was. And I think once people understand who you are, they tend to be a little more empathetic and conscientious about the demands they make of you. And so I actually successfully completed my PhD, I would say, with, pretty good support around me, and not just from home, but from the lab. So it was demanding, and it probably wasn't the best work-life situation. But with support and with communication, I think communication is one of the key things. It can be done. I went to Pfizer and I was still doing very basic research. And so, it being in the research unit. And so it still got to a point where I wasn't feeling fulfilled. As I said, I wanted to go to medical school. I wanted to interact with patients, have an impact. And so after 10 years, I actually had a career shift. I moved into patient advocacy. So I decided that I wanted to work more closely with patients. And I got into this role as patient engagement lead, which really entails partnering with patients, with patient advocacy groups, and really bringing their voice to our research, understanding their unmet needs, their experiences with disease, and making sure that that's taken into account as we develop new therapies. So now I feel like I'm very fulfilled. And I think a big part of work-life balance, for me, it's not about work-life balance, and maybe I have a different definition of it. For me, it's about fulfillment. I think if you love what you do and if you find joy in it, it almost doesn't feel like work, right? And as long as you're able to, communicate with your family, of course, part of it is you might be fulfilled, but are you leaving others out? And so being able to still balance and take time for your loved ones, for your children, your husband, etc., I think is important. And I think for me, being in a company like Pfizer, it probably made it a bit easier than, of course, a student who's pursuing their PhD. There are a lot of opportunities to leverage your networks. You're working in cross-functional teams. There are ways to sort of balance it and get others to help in certain areas. And I can talk a little more about that as you go into the questions. I don't want to take too much time, so I'll let Jane go ahead.
You're muted, Jane.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Jane, and I sometimes, Jane Reusch, and I sometimes think a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I tried to make a few simple pictures to go along with my story. And to, you guys, just I got that. To talk about what I would call not work-life balance or work-life integration, but the continuum, and to basically take the time to ask a moment, ask, what is it that I want? What do I want in my work that I am passionate about, and what are my ambitions? And then couple that with am I passionate about outside of work, and what are my aspirations there? And so I feel like I have been given a long-term picture of where I want to be, and then I have to ask myself, how did I get there? So I have what I've often, and anybody who's known me for very long would know, have the world's best job. And what I mean by that is to be a physician and to be a scientist. So how did I get there? Well, I was born on Lake Chautauqua, south of Buffalo, and then we moved north of Buffalo to Niagara Falls. And in my farm town, sort of 5 farm towns put together school, my 7th grade science class was all about learning through experimentation on doing physics. And I just loved this. And I thought, whoa, I want to do science when I grow up. And then when I went to college, I was a biology major at Notre Dame. And then theology was a really fascinating topic at Notre Dame. So I was a double major in biology and theology, and somehow spent my summer up learning how to key out insects, aquatic insects, and thought maybe I will reroute the entire Upper Peninsula Michigan medical infrastructure so that I can provide care for people in the middle of nowhere. But then I went to medical school, and in medical school, I had a second-year lecture by a visiting professor, Roger Unger, who is one of the leads in integrative physiology of carbohydrate metabolism. And carbohydrate metabolism just sparked my imagination. How could anything so integrated control sugar at such a tiny level? And my brain exploded. I said, this is fantastic. I want to study this. And simultaneously, my father had type 2 diabetes. And I thought, I've really got to, this is what I want to look into when I grow up. And so here I was wanting to be part of our further understanding of diabetes and carbohydrate metabolism with very minimal lab experience. And so here's my mentor, Dr. Boris Droznin, who said, you're a physician scientist, you need to do one clinical project and one basic project. And lo and behold, as somebody who never did basic science, I fell in love with basic science and signal transduction. And then I developed my first scientific question, all mine, really not what Boris was looking into at all. And then I was able, in the landscape of the early 1990s, to define my question and come up with my hypothesis. And my hypothesis was that since insulin and cyclic AMP are different than each other, the two would do something different. And my experimental results showed that I was wrong. So I learned my first academic history, which is a lesson, which is make a plan and then follow the data. So over the next little while, I was able to show that this transcription factor, CREB, was important for survival, differentiation, and metabolism, and that diabetes led to its degradation. So I met Dr. Regensteiner at the end of the 1990s, and she had this fabulous clinical question. And I thought, I wonder if my bench research could inform this big question that we want to ask. I know about diabetes, I know about physiology. Could I look at complex integrated physiology and really ask a big question? And so I took my basic science expertise and my clinical expertise and became more of a clinical investigator to do translational research. Now, I got to have the world's best job. And so when I want to talk about work-life integration, one of the things I learned from executive leadership in academic medicine is that your job description needs to match your priority. So if I think my job description is discovery and taking great care of people, is that really what I'm getting paid to do? And that is so very important, because if I think I want everything to be in balance, but this is my job description, then everything is going to fall apart. So the other question in work-life integration is, what are your non-professional priorities? Relationships, health, creative outlets, spiritual life. And I can't really help you to address those personal priorities, except to tell you a little bit about what I try to do. I try to be kind to myself, to not just forever be beating myself up. I try to live the mantra that boundaries are compassionate. I try to be present and grateful, and I try to sleep, eat clean, exercise, and appreciate the things I love. So I'm going to stop here, stop sharing, and just, I think, open us up for the discussion.
This is so great. I love these themes that have come out about, the personal goals and finding fulfillment, but also the importance of communicating that in order to generate the work-life continuum that works for individuals. One of the questions we received was, you may personally have a sense of what brings you fulfillment and your own work-life goals, I'll say. But how do you communicate those boundaries with your colleagues and mentors? I think some of you spoke about doing that with your family, which I think in some ways might be a little bit easier than doing it with colleagues and mentors. Any ideas or thoughts about that question?
Yeah, I can go ahead. It's Anne-Marie. So at this point, and Barbara mentioned my son who is a gymnast, I juggle quite a bit. So I work at Pfizer. I have a nonprofit to aid my island. I, balance that with family, including a son who's on the U.S. National team and Olympic athlete, I should say. And it's a lot of travel. It's a lot of work. But I mentioned in the beginning communication, right? And I think before communicating, one of the things is really setting your priorities. And I think Jane said that really well, right? Setting your priorities, knowing what is your purpose, what do you want to accomplish, what has to be accomplished now versus later. One of the things I use, and I learned that from actually a guest speaker that was brought to Pfizer to talk about time management and sort of not necessarily work-life balance, but working more efficiently. And he talked about the Eisenhower matrix. And I picked that up and I've been using it since then. And I wouldn't say I do this optimally. There are times when I get swamped with work and I have to sort of reprioritize and say, okay, where do I draw that boundary? But the Eisenhower matrix, for those of you who don't know what it is, it has 4 quadrants. And it's basically what's urgent or very important that you have to do, let's say, within the next 2 days. What's important but not urgent, right? That you can schedule a time to do it, right? What's less important that you can probably delegate to someone, right? Or get help with it some way or the other. And what you really don't need to do, like, indulge in social media, things that you can literally just eliminate. That's in your 4th quadrant. And I think once I used that and I sort of prioritized, what I have to do now, what can be left behind, what I just need to eliminate, it really helped me to focus and to sort of block out interferences. So if I know I have a deadline tomorrow, for example, that's in my very first quadrant, and I'm asked to do something, I can say, I have this to do for tomorrow. I have a very strict deadline. Can I do it in a couple of days? Can I get it to you by the end of the week? Can I, I think it makes it much easier to communicate because you can justify why you're pushing back, right? And I think for students, that's even more important. For me, I probably don't have to justify as much, but as a student, if you're saying no, especially to your PI or somebody that, is above you, you typically feel guilty and want to justify it. And I think if you have these priorities set, you can, it's easier to justify and not just say no, but say, I can't get it to you by tomorrow, but can I get it to you by this date, right? What are your expectations? When do you need this by? That sort of thing. I think the other thing, and that also entails communicating on the side of your family, right? If I have priorities at work, I speak to my husband, I speak to my children, I say, okay, I have this that's due on Monday, so I'm going to have to work on Saturday, right? That sort of thing. You have to, communication, I think, is a key aspect of this. And I think once people understand what the priorities are, especially if it's not, a daily thing, once in a while they know you have a deadline that you really have to meet, I think people are very understanding and you can, communicate that to them, whether it's your colleagues or your mentees, mentors, or your family. And it also entails blocking off time. So once you know the priorities, you can block off time for them and say, okay, I can't do it then.
Judy or Jane, did you want to comment on that?
So I think that this idea of prioritization can be a little bit further enhanced by want, need, and ought to do, it's sort of, I must do this. This is in my job description. I want to do this. This aligns with my goals. I ought to do this. Well, if the word ought comes in, then you could probably consider that maybe you ought to do it, or maybe you shouldn't ought to do it. Maybe you should, like Anne said, maybe you should delegate it. Maybe you should say no. And as somebody who is around for a long time at a given institution, you have things that you've done over the years, And then they just kind of pile on, and you think, well, I ought to do that. I've already got my talk ready. And you need to try and be very thoughtful about the things that you might not do in those realms, and the opportunities you could conceivably give somebody else to do them, if you wanted to really be creative about trying to use what you ought to do to support somebody else and let them do it and be in a leadership position.
I think the concept of saying no to people is difficult. There are some things I have tried to say no to, some things that then people just can't understand how I could say no to some things that I should, I ought to do it, but I don't want to do it, or I can't do it because I have a grant due, and that tends to take precedence, papers and grants. But I think it needs to become more acceptable to say no. And if you're a young person, I think it's infinitely harder. I mean, sometimes I think it's infinitely harder if you're a more senior person, but it is hard for a young person facing a mentor asking them to do something, or something they don't want to do. But we have to work on that more in our whole society to get to know, because sometimes that's the right answer. And I think with a junior person, a lot of times they get asked to do so many things, like write too many reviews chapters, or which I think there should be a limit to that, or just they get asked to give so many talks, and it seems flattering. And I think people think if they say no, they will never get asked again. And in fact, that is not true. You'll get asked to do more things probably, but you have to be able to say no. And setting some boundaries with your mentor can help with that. And your mentor can help you with the boundaries. You can say, my mentor said I can't do that right now. And that's a good out. I love that. So I think not saying yes to everything doesn't make you unpopular, and it actually probably makes you more popular for various reasons. But we do have to get to a place where saying no is an acceptable answer, and not considered to be a sign of, evil and intransigence, where hey, this person doesn't want to do anything. There has to be a better way, especially for young people, because you can get overburdened in no time.
And I love that aspect and idea of calling in a mentor to help you say no, potentially, right? Or finding other people who can kind of be a champion for you to say no if they know what your goals are. One thing that Jane brought up, and I think a couple of you might have some experience with, is how do you delegate some of those tasks? You guys have all kind of alluded to this delegation of when are there things that maybe you ought not to be doing, as Jane put it. Specifically, how do you get help, like admin support, to do some of the tasks that you think are delegatable, and how do you actually make sure you use it successfully to allow you to free up your time for those other work items that you really want to be doing?
I think that's really hard, just because a lot of people don't have administrative support. And I think that's a mistake from an institution not to provide administrative support. So you see somebody who's incredibly talented doing something that is taking their time, but not particularly rewarding, or not at all rewarding. So I think administrative support, it'd be well worth an institution's money and time to invest in that. I'm a person who, because I have a certain type of training grant that I'm the principal investigator on, the Birch grant, Building Interdisciplinary Research Careers in Women's Health, I do have administrative support, and it makes a huge difference. I have to schedule a lot of meetings. There is no benefit to my scheduling those meetings. They will mostly be scheduled improperly, with people meeting at different times, and it's not a good fit for me. So let me do my work and let somebody help me schedule it, give somebody else a job, and they can help me with scheduling, help me with the programs I work on. So I think it's really important. I think that's institutional change we're talking about, and not particularly easy, but I think it's really important. Anne-Marie may have a different experience because you work for a company. Thankfully.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I was about to say that I think one of the things I learned in going from academia to industry is that you don't have to do it all. I think in academia, you have that sense that you have to do the work. It's your PhD, it's your research, you have to do it. And I think when I got into industry, I learned, that you can leverage people with different expertise to help you do things, right? In some cases, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. You can have somebody show you something or even help you do it, where they do it and you contribute to it by continuing on the other end. I think in industry, it's much easier. There are tons of people with different expertise, and you tend to work on, sort of cross-functional teams. And so people work a lot together, right? And you tend to leverage the strengths and the expertise of different people. And I think this is something, but I think this is something that can be transferred to academia, where you're in a lab, you're swamped with one thing. There's a step to it that one of your peers, one of the other students in your lab can help with. Don't be afraid to ask, right? Ask the question, can you help me with this part? Can you do this for me? And I mean, it's not something that you're doing every day where you're shying away from your work, right? You're at a point where you need some help, you're requesting help. And I think we tend to not want to do that as students. So I would strongly recommend that students and even young professionals ask for help. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Build those networks, build those partnerships and friendships at work or in your lab, and leverage the strengths of others to help you, be more productive.
Sorry, I'm also taking notes. This is such great discussion and great points. I love the idea of the trainees starting to even think about asking for help at that stage. It probably gets more comfortable if you practice doing so.
It might be simple as helping to make your buffers. You're doing the experiment, they're helping to just prepare some buffers for you. I mean, simple things that we can get help with that we're just afraid to ask.
Yeah. So, I have a couple other posed questions from what we received, but I actually, we have a great turnout here. Does anyone want to unmute and ask a question that you might have after hearing from our panelists? And if you could either unmute and ask that question, or you could put it in the chat.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for this discussion. It's super helpful. I'm Danielle. I'm an assistant professor at University of Colorado. And my question is about how to ask for help or delegate when you're at an early career stage and you don't have many people you can delegate to. Like, for example, I can only afford a 50% research assistant at this time who's brand new, just graduated with her bachelor's degree, has no research experience. So sometimes it's like the blind leading the blind right now.
You could ask your division head possibly for support, especially in the first few years of appointment. And I would argue that negotiating up front when you take a position is a skill that very few people come to naturally, but that's really important. So how you start in terms of salary and support from your division is going to dictate how you may continue. And asking for support for a half-time PRA is not unreasonable. You're working to try to get funded. You're working to be able to be more independent. And why not help you get there rather than make it painful for you? So asking is a good tool. And you might think that your boss will say, oh my God, this person is asking me for resources. I don't have resources. That's what resources they have isn't actually your issue. They're the boss and they can think about it. And it makes sense because it will make you more productive. It'll help you get your work done, help you get funded. I have known many people who've been able to ask for part-time PRA help, and it has been life-changing.
I think, was it Jane or is it Judy who made the comment about sort of training someone, right? Where you might ask for help from someone who probably want to learn that skill that you're asking them to help you with, right? And so it's a learning opportunity for them, and it becomes sort of a leadership opportunity for you because you're training someone. So it's a win-win. And I think, it doesn't have to be, it might not be paid staff. They might be paying you because not paying you. They might be willing to do it because they're learning. So for them, it might be a learning opportunity. For them, it might be a co-publication opportunity. They're doing something with you and having the opportunity to get on your paper. So I think it's being innovative in terms of finding help, where you pitch it as something that's beneficial to them too. So it becomes a mutually beneficial relationship, where it's a win-win.
And to sort of take that a little bit further, and Danielle, maybe a little bit specific to junior people, you are starting your career and you may be very, very skilled in one thing that you know how to do better than anyone else around. And that is probably extraordinarily valuable, right? So it could maybe be applied to somebody else's work. And so these partnerships may lead to joint authorship, but also then you may be able to kind of trade on that in order to get some other aspects of a complex research project done that these other people don't know how to do. So I think that it's really sort of taking a little bit of an account of the assets that you do have. Now, I have been 100% unsuccessful in having any kind of administrative support over the 30 plus years that I've been in this business. And so I developed unnecessarily mad skills at building PowerPoints and EndNote, etc., which means that I usually get to do those things for the team, which is not really a good use of my time. But I could teach somebody else to do it, and then they know how to do it, and then they can build it into our lab productivity, etc. So just sort of respecting what you're bringing to the equation may help you feel much less like you're asking for a favor than you're asking for a partnership.
Mm-hmm. Love that.
I still believe in asking for money. So.
Oh yeah, I would always ask for money, but but sometimes you get it.
And I'll just add for you, Danielle, as a junior faculty, sometimes you don't know until you get started what your needs are going to be. And you can actually make a stronger case now that you have experience to say that you could use this support really effectively now that you've already started. So the negotiation, as Judy mentioned, doesn't have to happen before you start. That can be a discussion you have later on. And we'll probably have a future session on negotiation, but I just want to make sure you think about that opportunity to do it even after you've already started. Anyone else have a question? I see some people have come off video, so if anyone else wants to unmute or ask a question, please feel free to.
Hi, my name is Leanne. I'm a PhD student at UF, and I loved hearing all of the amazing panelists' introductions. I did have a question about what if the career position that you want to serve in doesn't exist yet? And how do you kind of like create and invent this space to implement kind of these unique skills? My background is I'm an RN, and I kind of was resonating with you, Jane, because I didn't have a lot of basic science experience. I had a little bit, but now I'm creating this space where I'm, hoping to be, immunologist by trade, but then combining that skills with my patient interaction. And so I haven't seen that, as like a, thing that's common to do, but I know that a lot of you guys have invented a space that's very unique, and I'm wondering about that.
Judy invented a whole center from scratch. We're going to let her get started there.
I was one of the co-founders, and I'm the director of the Ludeman Family Center for Women's Health Research. Women's health research, many of you probably know, is very understudied. As a result, many of the treatments that we all receive are based on treatments that were only really studied in men, white men for that matter. So there's a lot of, women are treated as if one size fits all, so if one drug works one way in men, it must work the same in women. And that isn't data based, at least. So anyway, my colleagues and I developed a center. We focus on the cutting edge science in women's health, in mentoring and training the next generation young MD and PhD scientists, and educating the public and healthcare providers about what we do, because that's been made us successful to have a center like this. We've mentored, funded, trained about 100 young scientists to date as of this year. And Jane is co-associate director, by the way, and amazing. as always. But I was able to create this with, not by myself, with a lot of help and with a lot of colleagues. And that's what it takes. So if you have an idea, this university, University of Colorado, allowed me to pursue that idea and allowed me to work with my colleagues. I'm pointing at you, Jane, although I realize that nobody could possibly see that, so I will point to you more enthusiastically, and other colleagues. It's been an amazing journey. It could have failed, but it did. I never thought it could fail because it's so important. But there's a lot, it's research, it's bench research, it's clinical research, it's big data, all the types of research. It's cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and mental health are 3 main areas. So if you have a big idea, go for it. I mean, take those steps, because life is short, and if you have something you're just so passionate about, you can't contain yourself, go for it. And it's taken a lot of work. The center is going to enter its 20th year next year, which I can't even believe. But we've now raised 4 endowed chairs in women's health where there were none at my university, and we're working like crazy to get young scientists, both men and women. It's mostly women, but still, we want men in the field, get them funded. We have NIH grants supporting some of this. We have the public supporting some of this with philanthropy. It has been a wonderful journey most of the time. And
so it looks like Anne wants to say something. I just want to say one thing specific to the question. Women didn't used to have somebody to look at that looked like them, and didn't used to have somebody to look up to that looked like her. I didn't have a physician scientist who did bench research to really be looking up to. If you know that you have something to bring as a nurse to these questions, then those questions will be enriched by your experiences. So Anne, you had unmuted and I know you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add. So I also sort of created my role within the internal medicine unit. So I was an islet biologist doing bench science, which I really enjoyed. But as I said, I wasn't totally fulfilled because I really wanted to work more closely with patients. But with mentors in my life, I would say it was highly driven by very good mentors who really encouraged me to network, to build relationships, and to basically express my my passion. And that's what I did. I literally, told my supervisor, my CSO, that I didn't want to do what I was doing anymore. And I had a great supervisor who allowed me to, for example, go to patient advocacy summits, even while I was a scientist, and just get a sense for what the role was, what it entailed. And so I had been learning about the role, and I started sort of building a value proposition that I pitched to them. And I said, this is something that could really bring value to the unit. And I had to really sell it. But I was skeptical. I mean, I'm a young Black woman, didn't see people like me in my role, as Jane said. And so I didn't think that it would have gone anywhere. If anything, I thought I was going to be laid off. And it did get to that point where, we were having a big reorg in the organization. And knowing that, I didn't really want to be where I was, I had made it very clear. I think I was probably first on the list, as a favor to me. She doesn't want to do this anyway. Why force her to do it? That sort of thing. But I actually then found out that the word had gotten through and the department was willing to create that role. And knowing my passion, I was given the opportunity to interview for it, and I ended up getting into that role. And I had no experience, right? I got into the role as a scientist, but I was allowed to sort of build the position and really execute on it. But again, it's communication. I keep coming back to communication. Right? I had communicated about it. And if you have good mentors and good managers, people want to see you succeed. I learned that, right? A good manager will help you fulfill your career needs. And so being open and communicate to them what your goals are, your short-term, your long-term goals, where you see yourself in the next 10 years, and ask them to help you get there. Right? And I found out that it works. So, speak to people who are in similar positions. They might not be in your organization, but there might be similar roles that uses your skills, other places, find out what it looks like, and that sort of gives you an idea of how you create that role. So build those networks.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Anyone else in our attendees here who would like to ask a question? Paige, I saw you unmute. You want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll just go ahead. And this was a question that came up from some of people who registered ahead of time. Of course, if someone has a different question, feel free to jump in. But I want to kind of switch focus a little bit to sort of like the emotional side of work-life balance. And I'd love for you all to speak a little bit about how you get rid of guilt from prioritizing yourself and your family when you need to. I think especially as a young trainee, you feel all that pressure to do all the things, but you also want to enjoy life. And so kind of how that process has been for you.
Difficult. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jane.
Yeah. So I definitely would say that it's not easy. My process was made slightly easier by the fact that my husband was a cardiologist, which basically meant that when he was at the hospital, if my children needed to be picked up or whatever, then that was what I had to do. And so I didn't have the opportunity to not do it. And so what I would say is that I created a format for myself to just say, okay, when I'm at work, and I was even almost a little bit unfriendly at work, I'm going to have my head down doing work. And then when I get home, I'm home. And I'm home, and so as my career became accelerated and more complex, I couldn't be so concrete about those things, being home, and sometimes work has to happen and sometimes home has to happen. But I would just say then recently I have been reading this book called The Gift of Imperfection. So total pop psychology, Brene Brown. But one of the things that it has really helped me with is this idea that I can't be perfect all the time. So I don't have to be perfect all the time. I'm going to fail no matter what. So I might just sort of need to be kind to myself. And that is why the first thing I listed on what I'm trying to do for myself is to be kind and to say, wow, I can't possibly get all of this done by this time. And so I've got to say that out loud. And I've got to say, I love to cook, but that doesn't mean I can be home cooking dinner every night. So those are sort of some specific thoughts about there's the imperative, aka on the Eisenhower matrix, urgent, but also there's the what do I want to do, and what is just not going to possibly work right now, and so I have to let go of that. And that's not on the matrix, but let go of it is still, I think, something you have to practice, because you're going to be really bad at it and you're going to feel bad about it. But the more often you do it and you see that the world has not imploded, then you'll get better at it.
It's hard, but if you don't prioritize your family, it could have ramifications for you as they grow up. And I was lucky in that my husband was an engineer and he was more flexible in his timing than I was. So he was there more he was a true partner. He was there, able to be there and drive our daughter around when she needed to be driven around. And that was very fortunate. But there's times where it becomes achingly painful if you can't be there. And not only do I think that you need to be there when you want to be there, but you should be proud. So you should be able to say, I'm leaving now. I'm going to go see my kids play, and not feel like you have to hide that fact and not feel ashamed. And I think that takes work. And I think Brene Brown's book, it maybe pop culture, but it also is helpful. And I'm also reading it. So, and that was a coincidence. I didn't say, I'm not in a book club with Jane, although it's a great idea. I need a book club, but it's, there's a little bit of defiance in me that says, damn it, nobody's going to tell me what I consider important. And sometimes it's impossible. You have a grant due, it's due tomorrow. That's what you're going to do. But I was able to, because of a little bit of defiance that I mean, and I shouldn't have to feel that way about prioritizing my life over my work. I am still caught pretty heavily in work balance. And so it feels good to me sometimes to defy that and say, I'm going to go watch. I mean, my daughter's 29 now, so she doesn't have school plays, but it's still good for me to say, I'm going to hang out with her now. And she recently got married, which is a big event. And I hung out with her quite a lot, and her new husband and my husband. And it was fun. And fun is good. That's my bottom line. That comes from Dr. Seuss, who's been somewhat discredited, but he said, this is fun and fun is good. And it really is.
I agree. And when you're having fun at work, you take that home, right? You bring that joy home. When you're having joy at home, you bring it to work. So it's vice versa. But it's a very good question, because I think in a lot of cases, the burnout and the stress that people feel comes from guilt. If you didn't have that guilt, you would actually be perfectly fine. You wouldn't feel like you're being overworked or that, it's the guilt that actually does it. And I realized that in a lot of cases, we're the ones who bring the guilt ourselves. I'll give you a perfect example. I had a patient panel planned at work, and it was planned months in advance. And then I found out, I mentioned my son is a gymnast on the US team. I found out that there was the US Junior Olympic competition on the same day as my panel. And I stressed for about 3 weeks, not knowing how to tell my boss, not knowing how to tell my colleagues that I really wanted to go to this competition. And in my mind, I was saying, I don't know how I'm going to do this. This panel has been planned. I have patients coming in. And then I developed the guts one day to speak to my boss, and I let him know what the conflict was. And he looked at me like I was crazy. He said, what are you debating about? This is your son. Family is important. You can't miss this competition. And he was actually throwing out ideas of people he thought who could take my place and lead the panel, right? So it was all self-inflicted. I was taking on the guilt, and everybody else would have totally understood that this is my son's competition and I can't miss it. And it was a heavy load off my back. And I ended up going to the competition, and I was able to call in virtually. But sometimes, it's us putting the guilt on us, and you just have to put your priorities down and know what you want and communicate it. Again, the communication comes in there. If I hadn't spoken to him, I would have just probably not even gone to the competition, because I would have felt so guilty. So communicate your priorities and your purpose. And others are going to have to understand. You have to make them understand. They won't understand until you communicate it and you let them know what your situation is, what your life is, your family is, and there's certain things that you just have to do. So again, coming back to the communication.
Right. And I think that the point you just made, Anne, is so important, that also by you were a leader in this panel. And by you saying, I have this other priority, you were leading by example for sort of prioritization of the people who might not be as empowered as you. So taking a vacation, I tell my lab and my colleagues, it's so important to take a vacation. And I used to get sort of in trouble for taking vacation, because there were just two of us that sort of manned the whole VA clinic. And I'd be like, I can't just take my vacations Wednesday to Monday every day. So I could be every year. I need to be able to actually take a vacation. And that tension and that guilt that you have, to realize that also there is probably somebody else who might be able to step into your shoes. So it's a little bit of hubris almost to think that you're so important that nobody else could actually accomplish what you're going to add there.
And I should mention too, I mean, we probably make it seem very easy, it's, it's not as easy as it sounds. There are times when you have to prioritize in the opposite direction, right? There are times when there's a deadline for something where, as a team member, you're obligated to pull your weight. And sometimes you have to communicate to your family and say, I have this priority at work. I have this deadline I really need to meet. So I'm not going to be able to do this, but we can do this instead, or we can do it tomorrow instead. Or, so again, it's communication on both sides, but recognizing that you have to set the priority and know what needs to be done now and what needs to be done later, what you can push back, what you can delegate, that sort of thing. So it's still planning on your part.
This has been such great wisdom from all of you as leaders, and I love that you're giving us your examples, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. I know we're at the last couple of minutes of the session, and I want to make sure that I also take a moment to thank Paige and to thank Barbara Corky, who are on our WIELD Educate subcommittee, as well as the other members of our Educate subcommittee, because this is our first session, and it took a lot of thought to put together people who could speak on this topic and who could really share things that we all could learn from. And I hope others have really learned from this. In the last couple minutes, if any of our panelists have any last minute words they'd like to share to our attendees, I just wanted to give you a moment to do that.
Yeah, I would say, again, I don't think it's necessarily about work-life balance. It's about fulfillment, finding your passion, finding your purpose, and aligning that with work, right? So for example, my nonprofit that I do, it's aligned with my Pfizer work. So even when I'm doing that, it's sort of a break from Pfizer, but it's something that I really enjoy doing. So it doesn't feel like work, right? It feels like a break from Pfizer. And so if you align your passion and the work that you do, I think it makes it much easier, and it takes away the guilt too, because you love what you're doing, and it's much easier to communicate and say, this is what I want to do now.
And I would say that all of you who are on this call are amazingly accomplished and are going to do big things with your life. So I think gratitude for the opportunity to have a career that asks you for work-life integration, for the opportunity to do something that you're passionate about in your work, that should probably, as Anne was just saying, bring joy back to your family and back and forth.
I like what Anne Marie and what Jane said. I think it's also important if at some point your life isn't going the way you want it to, or if things are tough, which they will be in everybody's career. There are tough bumps. All of us on this panel could come up with some definite tough bumps to relate to you. It looks really smooth and nice when people become, distinguished professors or leaders of labs or whatever, but you got there the hard way too. So just remember that there are going to be hard times. If there's ever a time when you need to reflect on what you're doing and put yourself in a different direction, that's okay too. You just got to do a lot of thought and talk to your colleagues. That's the best thing about academia, is the wonderful people you get to work with. And the exciting scientific findings you also have.
Yes, and I'm glad we were able to pull people together from a common scientific area of interest, and show you 3 examples of people doing this work in 3 different spaces. So thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much for our attendees. And please join us at future WIELD events. And I'm glad we ended on time. So thanks again.
Thank you, Durga, and the whole Educate committee.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, it was really wonderful.
And Durga, feel free to share my email if anybody has further questions that we didn't get to. Happy to.
Great. Okay.
Nice to meet you, Anne Marie.
Nice to meet you, both of you.
Yeah,
you.
fantastic. And thanks for saying yes.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I love doing these things. I do a lot of them, so.
I really appreciate it. And it was kind of funny as you used your example, and that Judy kind of added in after we had to recreate someone for a work life issue. And so I actually